That summer, Daniel suggested a trip to a small coastal town, far from the noise of their daily lives. He told Claire that it would be a chance to recharge and spend time together, and Evelyn was invited along to make it a family experience. Claire loved the idea immediately. She had always cherished time by the sea, and she thought it would be healing for all of them. Evelyn, though cautious by nature, agreed as well. She had grown more protective in recent months, sensing something was wrong in Daniel's behavior, and she wanted to stay close to her daughter. The three packed their bags, unaware of just how much weight the trip carried for Daniel. Daniel Harris was the kind of man people pointed to when they spoke about success. At 38 years old, he had built a comfortable life as a financial consultant. With a respectable income, a well-kept house in the suburbs, and a polished reputation, he dressed sharply, drove a sleek car, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who seemed to know where his life was going. To neighbors and acquaintances, Daniel was proof that hard work paid off. To his wife Claire, he was a devoted partner who always found time for her despite his busy schedule. And to her mother Evelyn, he was the man who promised to keep her daughter safe and happy. On the surface, Daniel appeared steady, reliable, and admirable, but beneath the calm exterior, he carried a secret that gnawed at him constantly, a truth he could not allow anyone to uncover. From the very beginning of the journey, Daniel felt the tension he had been dreading. He noticed the way Claire and her mother whispered when they thought he wasn't listening. He saw the glances Evelyn gave him, quiet but sharp, as though she were trying to piece something together. It unsettled him, because Daniel had spent years perfecting his mask. He had learned how to smile at the right times, how to craft explanations for his late nights and his sudden trips out of town, how to maintain a balance between his public life and the secret one he had carefully hidden away. But masks had a way of slipping, and lately, the cracks were beginning to show. The secret weighed heavily on him each day of the vacation. His heart quickened whenever Evelyn asked a casual question about his work, or whenever Claire mentioned money disappearing from their accounts. It wasn't just paranoia. He knew they were close to the truth. Evelyn had always been sharp, and he could see in her eyes that she had already formed suspicions. Claire, trusting as she was, had begun to notice the late-night phone calls, the restless energy, the way her husband avoided certain topics. Daniel realized that if they compared their observations, everything would unravel. The life he had built, the image of a responsible husband, the respect of his colleagues, the illusion of stability, would collapse in an instant. The town they visited was small and picturesque, with quiet beaches, winding streets, and old inns that seemed frozen in time. Tourists came for the calm atmosphere, the fresh seafood, and the view of the endless horizon where the ocean met the sky. For Claire, it was a place of peace, somewhere she could laugh, take photographs, and hold her husband's hand as if life was still simple. For Evelyn, it was a place to observe, a quiet backdrop where she could study Daniel without distraction. For Daniel, however, the setting felt like a cage, every cheerful moment another reminder of the storm that threatened to erupt if his secret ever came out. Each evening, as the sun sank into the ocean and the town grew quiet, Daniel lay awake in the rented house by the shore, staring at the ceiling. His mind churned with thoughts of exposure, humiliation, and ruin. He replayed every risk he had taken, every decision that could now come back to destroy him. He thought about the lies he had told, so many that sometimes even he struggled to keep them straight. He thought about Evelyn's determination to protect her daughter and Claire's growing unease. He could see them circling closer to the truth with every passing day. The third evening was when everything began to take shape in Daniel's mind. Evelyn had left her notebook on the table, and while Claire was in the shower, Daniel's curiosity got the better of him. He flipped through its pages, his eyes scanning quickly over her tidy handwriting. His chest tightened as he read the notes she had kept. There were lines about the nights he had come home late, about strange phone calls he had taken in another room, about the times Claire had asked him questions and he had avoided them. Even more alarming were Evelyn's mentions of missing funds from the couple's accounts, things she had clearly pieced together from conversations with Claire. It was as if Evelyn had been building a case against him without ever confronting him directly. The days that followed were filled with an uneasy quiet. On the surface, everything looked ordinary. The three of them explored the town, visited the small cafes, and walked along the sandy shoreline as the waves lapped gently against the beach. To anyone watching, they were just another family, enjoying a summer trip. But beneath the calm picture, Daniel felt the pressure building. Every glance, every silence, every whispered word between Claire and Evelyn felt loaded with suspicion. He began to notice how often they left the room together, or how quickly they changed the subject when he appeared. It gnawed at him because he knew exactly what they were talking about. He had seen the doubt forming in his wife's eyes, and Evelyn had never trusted him fully to begin with. By the end of the first week, Daniel was no longer simply uneasy. He was terrified. He felt trapped between the life he pretended to live and the reality that could destroy him if it ever came to light. Every smile he forced, every casual conversation he joined, was an act of desperation. He knew that this vacation would not end like any other. The question was not whether his secret would surface, but how far he would go to stop it from being revealed. Daniel closed the notebook, his hands trembling slightly. He placed it back exactly as it had been, but the damage was done. The realization hit him hard. Evelyn had been documenting everything, and Claire was clearly involved. If they decided to confront him outright, he would be exposed. And if they chose to go further to the police, to his colleagues, or even just to family friends, his reputation would be destroyed. He had spent years building an image of success, but one word from them could bring it crashing down. That night, Daniel could barely eat. He sat at the dinner table with his wife and mother-in-law, forcing a smile as they spoke about the sights they wanted to see before the vacation ended. He nodded at the right times, but his mind was elsewhere. He could hear their voices, but behind the conversation, he kept replaying the words in Evelyn's notebook, the list of his lies written in black and white. He felt trapped, cornered in a way he had never experienced before. When they went to bed, Claire fell asleep easily beside him, but Daniel stared into the darkness. His heart pounded as he thought of what would happen if they revealed everything. He pictured the collapse of his career, the shame of being exposed, the whispers of colleagues who would call him a fraud. He imagined losing everything he had fought to build, not because of a single mistake, but because the walls of deceit had grown too high to contain. For the first time, the thought of losing it all seemed not just possible but inevitable. By dawn, he was exhausted, but certain of one thing: he could not let them ruin him. The stakes were too high, and the risk of exposure too great. He told himself that his survival depended on action, that desperate times required desperate measures. As he heard Claire stir beside him, waking slowly to the new day, he forced a calm smile onto his face, but inside his decision was already made. What had begun as fear had now turned into a dangerous determination, and he would carry it with him through every moment of the days that followed. As the hours stretched on, Daniel's fear began to harden into resolve. He convinced himself that he had only two choices: either allow them to expose him and watch his world collapse, or find a way to silence the threat before it destroyed him. The thought was terrifying, but it also carried a twisted sense of clarity. He began to replay scenarios in his head, searching for a way to make their suspicions disappear forever. The more he thought about it, the more desperate he became. His mind cycled through frantic solutions, denying everything, begging for forgiveness, even abandoning his life altogether, and disappearing. But none of it felt realistic. Evelyn was relentless, and once she had her mind set on something, she would not let go. Claire trusted her mother's instincts, and Daniel knew she would eventually believe every word Evelyn had written down. The secret he had hidden for so long was already slipping from his control. They left shortly after noon. The car hummed along the winding roads, its windows rolled down to let the salty air drift inside. Claire was cheerful, snapping pictures with her phone and pointing out the small fishing boats bobbing in the water below. Evelyn sat quietly in the back seat, her gaze fixed on the road ahead, her sharp eyes occasionally flicking toward Daniel. He felt her watchfulness, and it hardened his resolve. Every glance from her seemed to confirm what he already knew. She had pieced too much together. The morning sun rose over the coastal town, casting a soft glow on the narrow streets and distant cliffs. But for Daniel Harris, it brought no sense of peace. He had spent the night tossing in bed, his mind heavy with the decision he had made in the dark. By the time Claire and Evelyn stirred awake, the plan was already fixed in his thoughts. He smiled faintly over breakfast, answering questions about where they should go that day, all while concealing the truth that he had chosen this to be the day everything ended. His wife and her mother believed they were headed for a scenic drive, a chance to enjoy one of the most beautiful views the town had to offer. To Daniel it was the stage he needed to turn suspicion into silence. The cliffs loomed larger as they drove higher. The narrow stretches of asphalt wound sharply left and right, bordered only by thin guardrails that looked fragile against the vast drop into the sea. Daniel had studied these roads before. He knew the precise spots where the slightest error would lead to disaster. As he gripped the steering wheel, his hands damp with sweat, he rehearsed the accident in his mind. He imagined the car swerving, the metal breaking, the plunge downward. He told himself it would be over quickly, that no one would ever question such a tragedy on a road known for danger. Claire laughed, suddenly, holding up her phone to capture a picture of the endless horizon. The sound pierced through Daniel's focus, a reminder of her innocence, of the life they had shared. For a split second his heart faltered. The weight of what he was about to do pressed down harder than ever. He saw flashes of their early years together, the quiet dinners, the vacations filled with real happiness, the simple comfort of her hand in his. But just as quickly as the memory came, it was pushed aside by the image of Evelyn's notebook, words scrawled on paper that could unravel everything he had built. He could not allow that. The car approached a sharp bend, one of the most dangerous on the road. The ocean glimmered below, waves crashing violently against the rocks. Daniel tightened his grip on the wheel, forcing himself to breathe evenly. He could hear Claire humming softly beside him, unaware, and Evelyn shifting in the back seat. The moment had come. He jerked the wheel abruptly, sending the car careening off its path. Tires screeched, the guardrail splintered, and then they were airborne. The world spun in chaos, shattering glass, twisting metal, the deafening roar of impact, as the car slammed into the rocks below. When the motion stopped, Daniel's ears rang with silence. He opened his eyes slowly, every muscle in his body aching, and turned his head. Claire sat slumped in the passenger seat, her body motionless, her face pale in the broken light. A wave of cold certainty washed over him. She was gone. His chest tightened with something sharp, but he pushed it down. Survival left no room for grief. Then he heard a faint sound from behind him. Evelyn. She was alive. Barely. Blood ran down her face. Her breath shallow but persistent. Her eyes flickered open, and for a moment they locked onto his. In that instant, Daniel knew she understood. Even in her broken state, there was recognition in her gaze, an accusation without words. She knew this was no accident, and if she survived, she would tell the world. Daniel forced himself out of the wreckage, stumbling onto the rocks. His hands shook as he pulled open the back door, his mind screaming that this was unfinished. He knelt beside her, staring at the woman who had always distrusted him, the woman who had been moments away from destroying him. For a brief second, he hesitated, but then he pressed his hand down firmly over her throat. Evelyn's body struggled weakly, her eyes burning into his with the last of her strength. Then the fight drained from her, leaving her still and silent. Daniel staggered back, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling with the weight of what he had done. Both women were gone now, and the cliffside echoed only with the crash of waves. He told himself it was necessary, that this was the only way to protect everything he had built. He looked up toward the road, already thinking of how he would explain this. A tragic accident, he would say, a twist of fate. The cliffs had claimed lives before, and no one would suspect otherwise. The news spread quickly through the quiet coastal town. A tragic accident on the cliffs, a husband who survived while his wife and her mother had not. People whispered with pity as Daniel sat in the hospital, his arm bandaged, his face pale but calm. To everyone who looked at him, he was a man broken by loss, a victim of cruel fate. He played the role well, his eyes cast downward, his voice trembling when he spoke to nurses and officers. Sympathy poured in from neighbors, family and friends. They sent messages of support, meals and prayers, all believing the same story, that Daniel Harris was the sole survivor of an unimaginable tragedy. Climbing back up to the road, he rehearsed the words he would use when help arrived, forcing his face into an expression of anguish. He reminded himself to shake, to cry, to look like a man who had lost everything in an instant. Yet, beneath the performance, a quiet dread lingered. He had covered his tracks, silenced the threat, but somewhere deep inside he wondered if the world would really believe him. That doubt gnawed at him as he reached the roadside, waiting for the sound of approaching sirens to break the silence of the coast. The funeral was heartbreaking for those who attended. Claire was remembered as a loving wife, gentle and kind, while Evelyn was honored as a strong woman devoted to protecting her daughter. Daniel stood at the front, his hands folded, tears glistening in his eyes at all the right moments. He greeted relatives with shaky hugs and accepted condolences with quiet gratitude. More than one person said aloud how unfair life could be, to take two good women and leave one grieving man behind. In that moment, Daniel appeared as nothing more than a victim of circumstance. For a while, it seemed as though his plan had worked. The wreck was written off as another accident on a notoriously dangerous stretch of road. The cliffs had taken lives before, and they would take more in the future. No one questioned it at first, but in the weeks that followed, small details began to trouble the investigators assigned to the case. The crash site, when examined closely, revealed tire marks that told a strange story. The skid patterns suggested not an attempt to brake, but a deliberate swerve into the guardrail. It wasn't enough to make a claim, but it raised an eyebrow. Then came the autopsy reports. Claire and Evelyn had been found with traces of sedatives in their systems. The amounts were not enough to render them unconscious, but enough to dull their senses and reactions. Investigators wondered why two healthy women on vacation would have such substances in their bodies. The thought lingered. Had they been drugged before the accident? If so, by whom? The only person close enough to provide it was Daniel. Detectives decided to take a closer look at his life. On paper, Daniel seemed successful, but financial records told a different story. Beneath the polished exterior, there were hidden accounts, debts, and large sums of money unaccounted for. Transfers to unfamiliar names and offshore locations painted a picture of someone trying to hide financial instability. It didn't match the man who claimed to be a stable consultant with a bright future. The deeper they looked, the stranger it became. Those around Daniel noticed subtle cracks in his facade as well. A friend recalled how quickly he had changed the subject when asked about the accident, his eyes avoiding direct contact. Another mentioned how, at the funeral, his grief had seemed oddly controlled, almost rehearsed. No one had thought much of it at the time, but when combined with the investigators' growing concerns, the image of a grieving husband began to shift into something darker. Detectives quietly reopened the case, careful not to alert Daniel. They interviewed those who had known the family, asking about their relationships. What they found only fueled suspicion. Evelyn had confided to a close friend before the trip that she was worried about Daniel. She had noticed things about his behavior that didn't sit right, and she believed Claire was beginning to see them too. That friend repeated the conversation to investigators, confirming that Evelyn had been keeping an eye on her son-in-law. The picture was changing quickly. What had once seemed like an accident now looked like something planned. The combination of sedatives, suspicious financial activity, and Evelyn's documented doubts painted Daniel not as a victim but as a man with motive. Investigators decided to dig further, combing through his phone records and computer history. What they uncovered was more damning than they expected. As detectives pieced everything together, they began to see the accident for what it truly was: Not a twist of fate, but a calculated decision. Daniel had planned it carefully, believing the cliffs would hide his crime, but the details he overlooked, the drugs in their systems, the digital evidence on his devices betrayed him. When the findings were presented to the authorities, Daniel was no longer seen as the grieving husband. He was the prime suspect in a double homicide. The man who had once been pitied was now quietly watched, every movement noted, as investigators prepared to close in. For Daniel, the mask he had worn so carefully was beginning to crack, and the world was finally seeing what lay beneath. In the days leading up to the accident, Daniel had searched online for methods of staging car crashes. He had read articles about how investigators determined fault from tire marks, and he had researched whether sedatives could be detected in toxicology reports. The trail was undeniable. Every search linked back to him, and together they built a chilling picture of premeditation. Daniel's downfall began quietly, with a knock at his door one grey morning. Two detectives stood outside, their expressions unreadable, their voices polite but firm. They told him they had follow-up questions about the accident, routine clarifications for their files. Daniel invited them in, forcing a smile, though his chest tightened. He had practiced this role for weeks, the grieving husband cooperating with the authorities, willing to relive his tragedy if it meant helping them close the case. He poured them coffee, sat across from them, and answered carefully. But even as he spoke, he noticed the way they watched him, not with sympathy, but with scrutiny. They weren't simply gathering facts, they were circling closer to the truth. At first, the questions seemed ordinary. How fast had he been driving? Did he remember the weather conditions? Had the women taken any medication that morning? But then the tone shifted. The detectives asked about his financial records, about money missing from his accounts. They asked if his wife had ever questioned him about late nights or strange phone calls. They mentioned the sedatives found in Claire and Evelyn's systems, and asked if he could explain them. Daniel's stomach knotted, but he kept his face calm, offering vague answers, pretending confusion where necessary. He claimed Claire sometimes took sleeping pills, though he couldn't recall the brand. He acted as though he had no idea why Evelyn would have anything similar in her system. The detectives nodded, writing in their notebooks, not pressing too hard. But Daniel sensed the trap tightening. After they left, he sat alone in the silence of his home, staring at the wall. His hands trembled as he tried to convince himself that they had nothing concrete, only suspicions. Still deep down, he knew the truth. They had more than he realized. Days later, his worst fear was confirmed. News broke that the investigation had officially shifted from accidental to criminal. Reports mentioned suspicious tire marks, sedatives, and new evidence pointing to foul play. His name was not yet released publicly as a suspect, but it was only a matter of time. The walls he had built so carefully over the years were collapsing, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. In court, the truth unfolded piece by piece, each revelation more damning than the last. Prosecutors presented his internet searches, the financial records showing hidden debts and offshore accounts, and the toxicology results proving Claire and Evelyn had been drugged. They painted a clear picture. Daniel had been drowning in financial ruin, terrified of exposure, and when his wife and mother-in-law began uncovering his secrets, he chose to silence them forever. The crash was not an accident. It was premeditated murder, staged to look like misfortune. The arrest came at dawn. Police cars lined the street outside his house, flashing lights cutting through the early fog. Neighbors peered through their curtains as officers led Daniel out in handcuffs, his head lowered, his face pale. The man they had once admired, the man they had pitied, was now accused of murder. His mask had finally shattered. The jury listened as witnesses described Evelyn's suspicions and Claire's growing unease. Friends testified about Daniel's unusual behavior, his lack of genuine grief, his controlled demeanor at the funeral. Experts explained the forensic evidence, the skid marks that showed deliberate swerving, the impossibility of mechanical failure. Every detail added another nail to the coffin of his defense. Daniel sat stone-faced through most of it, his hands folded tightly, his jaw clenched. He denied the charges, insisting he was innocent, that the investigators were wrong, but the evidence was too heavy, too precise. For those who had known Claire and Evelyn, the outcome was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but it could not bring back the lives lost. Their vacation, once meant to be a time of joy, had become a stage for betrayal and violence. Daniel's actions had stolen not only their lives, but also the trust of everyone who once believed in him. The image of the devoted husband and successful man was gone, replaced forever by the reality of a murderer who valued his own reputation more than the people closest to him. When the verdict came, the courtroom was silent. Guilty on all counts. The words hung in the air like a final sentence, erasing the last traces of the man he had pretended to be. He was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. As he was led away, he kept his head high, but inside he was hollow. The secret he had tried so desperately to protect had destroyed him, and in the end, nothing remained but the ruins of his lies. The case left a chilling lesson that lingered long after the trial ended. It showed how appearances can deceive, how a carefully crafted mask can hide darkness beneath. It revealed how secrets, when left to fester, can drive a person to unthinkable acts. Daniel Harris had tried to bury the truth under the guise of an accident, but truth has a way of clawing to the surface, and when it did, it exposed him completely, leaving him with nothing but a lifetime behind bars to face what he had done.